Half a century ago, while working as a journalist for ITN, I was responsible for thousands of reports on what was then the most popular news programme on British television, ITN's News at 10. The vast majority of those news stories were about things going wrong in society because those shaped the general editorial appetite at the time. But in reporting those, I became only too aware of what numerous people and organisations were doing to tackle society's problems. And I began to argue behind the scenes for regularly including those kind of stories in the news bulletins. Occasionally I succeeded, but on the whole my arguments were listened to with what I would describe as an almost amused tolerance and then largely ignored. For more than 15 years, I failed to find a public platform in the UK to discuss and debate the issue. So in 1993, I had no hesitation in accepting two invitations from America, one from the Town Hall of Los Angeles and the other from the University of Colorado School of Journalism to lay out my arguments in their annual Crossman Lecture. By this time, I was newscasting what was then BBC Television's main evening news programme, the 9 o'clock news. I wrote my speech and showed it to the BBC News management as required by my contract. To my amazement, I was called into a senior manager's office to be told they would not allow me to make it under any circumstances. The problem, they explained, was that I was quoting many examples from my BBC newscasting experience when strong positive stories had been dropped from news bulletins in favour of negative ones. And if I made the speech, and I quote, the British media would have a field day by quoting this chapter and verse from the BBC examples. But, I pointed out, these editorial decisions were an important part of the argument I was making, and I had included examples from several other broadcasters as well. But, they said, public perceptions are very important. What they meant was that the public perception of the BBC and the need to avoid what they saw as potentially unfavourable coverage was more important than having a public debate about key elements of decision-making within their news operation. Well, it didn't take me long to think about the issue involved. I told them I was going ahead with my speech, but by way of compromise, was prepared to go through it with the BBC News head of public relations. This I did over several hours of argument and discussion, keeping in most of my BBC examples, but attributing them to one international broadcaster I know, rather than mentioning the BBC by name. The head of PR then agreed the speech could go ahead, and I set off for Los Angeles a few hours later. Well, imagine my surprise when, at the end of that 11-hour flight to LA, I stepped off the plane to be handed a note saying, "Call the head of PR immediately." His message was this, and I quote, "I'm sorry, Tony," that's Tony Hall, who was then head of BBC News, "Tony has seen your revised speech and says you must not make it under any circumstances." At the same time, the BBC's head of contracts had called my agent to say that my job was on the line if I went ahead with the speech. Now, I saw red. Here was a well-respected news organisation, a global bastion of democratic debate, which quite properly probed, questioned and commented on every other sector of society. And yet they were refusing to turn that same eagle eye on themselves and engage in debate and discussion about news, values and judgments on their own territory. I found the double standards breathtaking, and after a discussion with my splendidly supportive wife, mainly about the threat to our mortgage, decided that I didn't want to work for them any longer, so would go ahead and make the speech and look for another job when I returned home. Sensibly, other media outlets showed none of the BBC's reticence for debating the issue. CNN did a 7-minute interview with me, which led their bulletins throughout the day. There was widespread coverage in the UK media, including an edited version of my speech filling a whole page of the Independent newspaper and extracts spread across 2 pages in the Daily Mail, followed by a week of arguments for and against the points I was making. How refreshing. But the BBC would still have none of it. Newsnight did ring up and asked if I would go into a studio in Los Angeles to be interviewed live down the line by Jeremy Paxman, and I, of course, agreed. 4 hours later, I got a call to say the interview had been cancelled on the instructions of Tony Hall. Later, the distinguished documentary maker Paul Heyman asked me if I would come and speak at one of the regular gatherings of senior BBC management to discuss my argument. A day or so later, he called with regret to say that the invitation had been withdrawn. Now that is how afraid the BBC were almost 30 years ago about this early manifestation of what we now know as constructive journalism. Interestingly, there were a few public attacks on me by a handful of prominent TV colleagues who had clearly not read my speech, but chose to indulge in that old journalistic trick. We can't find a sensible riposte to your argument, so let's distort it to give us an easier target to attack. I returned to London expecting to be fired as the BBC had promised, but to my surprise, as the chairman of the BBC later told me, letters and phone calls backing my argument had flooded into the BBC while I was away. What's more, my newscasting job was safe. Although before I went back into the newsroom, I was called into a meeting with two BBC managers who said, "You're not going to go banging on about this, are you?" To which I replied, "Of course I am," and went on to accept invitations to debate the issue from South Africa, Israel, Northern Ireland, and many UK journalism schools and organisations. One postscript to all this: I thought I would be under attack from colleagues once I went back into the newsroom, but it was the opposite. Many agreed with my arguments, including one distinguished war reporter who said, "You know, the BBC sends me to cover wars, and because I see these countries destroying themselves, I understand only too well the challenges they face to build back their society and institutions when the war is over. I've often asked the BBC if I can go back to cover that constructive side of the story, but I am almost always sent on to cover another war instead." All that was way back in 1993. How refreshing then to see almost a quarter of a century later the BBC News starting to embrace what is now called constructive journalism, although they prefer to call it solutions-focused journalism. They are part of a long overdue developing change in the media, driven to varying degrees by both public opinion and commercial priorities, with growing emphasis on reporting the considerable efforts of many people and organisations to put things right in the world, and to do this alongside the necessary reporting of what is going wrong. After all, in order to report on a potential solution, you have to outline the problem that provoked the need for that solution in the first place. Across the world, many others, ranging from Bill Gates backing the Solutions Journalism Network in America to Ulrich Hagerup forming the Constructive Institute in Denmark, have built up a powerful momentum for change. And yes, in my own much smaller way, I am still banging on about it. Now, it's not just the BBC embracing constructive journalism, but other prominent media organisations in the UK as well. So for this programme, we've brought together some of the best minds in British journalism, or rather we would have if COVID rules had not prevented all six of us getting together here in the studio for a great debate. However, I was able to talk to each of them on a one-to-one basis to enable them to lay out their views on a subject which is gathering real momentum around the world. So please meet Emma Tucker, editor of the Sunday Times; Mohit Bakaya, controller of BBC Radio 4; Mark Rice-Oxley, editor, columnist and head of audience engagement at The Guardian newspaper; Nadja Nielsen, digital director of BBC News; and Katie Vanneck-Smith, who stepped down as president of Dow Jones to be co-founder of Tortoise Media.